welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Cuffs Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined here in a few minutes by Blake Lovell. He does great work over at Southeastern 16. We're going to discuss how historic of a year this was for the SEC, and might this be a sign of things to come for the SEC? Was this a little bit of a one-off, or is it what my theory is? Somewhere between A and B, where the SEC is not going to be going anywhere in college basketball, but 14 teams in the NCAA tournament, we're probably not going to be seeing 14 teams in the NCAA tournament a lot more moving forward. So we're going to be discussing that, how he's going to be taking a look at the offseason, as well as we've seen a few moves out there in the SEC, one that needs to be made by Texas A&M as well in terms of their coaching search. So we'll be diving in upon that and so much more. And then in the final segment, I'm going to get you guys a little bit of a roundup as to all the news and notes we saw in college basketball on Wednesday. And this is a podcast that is going to be keeping up daily because we are getting a lot that is happening in college basketball. These teams that you're going to be loving in March, they're being built right now, and they are right now, all these teams trying to be able to build a roster, because I don't think that there is a single team right now that is out trying to build rosters. Like, I've had a few people, and rightfully so, ask me, hey, what do you think of this team coming into the season? How's this team done in the transfer portal? And all 364 of these teams right now, they get the exact same score from me. It's an incomplete. You have north of 2,000 players in the NCAA tournament. Are there a few teams that are off to a little bit of a better start? Yeah, like Keyshawn Hall going off to Auburn. That's a good start for Auburn. No question about it. The fact that North Carolina is going to be retaining Seth Trimble, that's a good start for them, but none of these rosters are set in stone. There is still a lot that needs to happen moving forward, so all these teams are going to be getting incompletes until we see a little bit more, and that's why I was talking about it on the podcast yesterday, that this is a little bit more of the hunting and gathering stage in college basketball. There's so many guys that need to decide where their next destination is going to be, and for some of these guys it might be the NBA as well. So we do have a lot to try to parse through, and we're going to be doing that over the next few weeks, which is why you are going to be getting daily podcasts from myself. And if you ever do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at GUNet_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter. So, per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Other than asking about specific teams, really didn't get a lot of Twitter/X questions, and I'll be trying to do my best to be able to give you guys insight on every one of these teams here in the offseason. And do be mindful as well, once we get these rosters set in stone a little bit more, I will be giving you guys specialized conference previews for every single one of these conferences as well. So you're going to be getting that coming into your lives in the coming months. Most of the time, I usually start these conference previews up in super duper late May, early June. So we're going to give it a little bit of time just because, again, you've got a lot of moving parts. You've got a lot of things that are happening right now. So I will be just mentioning that. But that said, you're going to be getting the podcast going daily, and we're going to look a little bit back at what we saw last season and turn it forward in terms of the SEC side of things with our good friend Blake Lovell next, right here on Cuffs Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Cuffs Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, and always great to be joined by this man as we've got Blake Lovell aboard. He does such a tremendous job over at Southeastern 16, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Followed the SEC every step of the way this season, did an amazing job of being able to cover it all. Additionally, I know that he is doing some work over at Clutch Point Sports as well. You're able to follow him on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell. And Blake, always great to get you aboard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks as always for having me, Greg.
Thank you so much for joining me, Blake. And Blake, we are off the heels of what we saw in the title game, and it was just a historic season for the SEC in general, capped off by a title. And just what did you make out of everything that we did see this season? Because start to finish, the SEC was the best conference in all of college basketball. Obviously, in the final game, Florida did not look like the best team throughout most of it, but somehow, some way, they find a way to be able to get through. And how much do you think just going through the gauntlet of that SEC slate did prepare Florida for that moment in which they were able to come back against Houston?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I think, like we said, all season long, if you looked at just the schedule aspect of playing in this league and sort of understanding that each of these games, I mean, more often than not, you're playing against the team that wound up making the NCAA tournament. You know, when you really looked at their schedule overall in the SEC, I mean, I think they only played LSU once. They played South Carolina twice. But, I mean, you know, all your other games are against teams that wound up making the tournament. And so I think just being able to be in those kind of games, some were close, some were not, that certainly played to their benefit once they got into the NCAA tournament, clearly, because, like you said, even just go beyond the Houston game where, you think Florida's sort of done for in that game. Well, there was a point earlier in the second half against Auburn where you're like, hey, maybe, Auburn's just going to turn it on here and that may be the game. Texas Tech, obviously, they're down whatever with 3 minutes to go and you're thinking there's no chance they're going to come back. And even in the UConn game, right? I mean, look at that game where they missed 12 free throws. The Maryland game didn't play great in the first half, but all that to say it's a survive and advance tournament. At the end of the day, every single time that Florida found themselves in those situations, sure, they got a little bit of help from the opponent, whether it was missed free throws, turnovers, missed shots, whatever. But at the same time, like they made a lot of plays. And we said all season long, if Walter Clayton was going to be the driving force of this team, what happens in a game where maybe he's not doing that? And we knew it could happen against a team like Houston, just given their defensive, output. But that's where we kind of saw that it's not just him, it's everybody else on this team that contributed to the championship run. And I thought that was really the story of the NCAA tournament for Florida, just beyond the obvious greatness of Walter Clayton. It was all the other different guys that they had step up in these games, not just from a scoring standpoint, from really, producing everywhere else too.
Oh, no question about it. It was incredible what we saw from Florida this season. And for Florida, just how many teams do you think are going to look to be able to build off of that blueprint? Because while we all talked about Walter Clayton going into that final game, it was not him that led Florida to the title game. Like, you could give as much credit as you'd want for assists, and the fact that he didn't give up on the game, even though his shooting was off, I think that that's a big credit to him. But I was saying this throughout the year, it felt like Florida was sort of that Noah's Ark team that had two of everything, two really good forwards, two really good guards. They had nice depth, and I really feel like that's, in this day and age, the blueprint that you need to be able to win a title. Not just one star player leading you, but a whole bunch of guys that could step up, and I really felt Florida had that this year.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes you kind of hear that, hey, depth's overrated when you get into the tournament. I've always sort of disagreed with that to a certain extent. Sure, you don't need a lot of depth if you just have one player who can come out and just completely take over a game. Maybe you go 6 or 7 deep and you're like, all right, that's it. But I'm always going to look at the teams like this, right, that are able to go out and play basically 8 guys the way that they played them in this championship game. And obviously, you can look back at some of these games throughout the season, but really that's what it wound up being. Like, it was an 8-man rotation. And I think, too, why it's so important to have those numbers is that in this era of transfers, there's no guarantee that every single guy you bring in is going to hit, right? There's no guarantee that everybody's going to come in and just be a no-brainer addition to your rotation. You may bring someone in and all of a sudden you're looking up and saying, you know what, that maybe isn't the fit that we thought for both parties. And that's where I think just having the numbers game in your favor. And look, I mean, the thing for Florida, right, is that they hit on all the guys they needed to hit on to be a regular part of that rotation, but they also got a Micah Henlogden back just for the stretch run of the season. We didn't think he was going to play this year, but they bring him back into the mix, and look how sort of important that wound up being with someone like a Sam Alexis, who was playing quite a bit early in the season, but then, didn't really play from, mid-February on. And so the numbers to me is what was most impressive about this team. They hit on the guys they needed to hit on to be your main top tier scoring guys, but it's just all the other parts around them. And I think that's where depth is so important, because there's no guarantee, like I said, that everybody's going to, work out perfectly. But, man, when they do, this is what you get. And, again, I know Henlogden didn't play a lot of minutes, but I still think having him on the floor for this run was a significant thing for Florida, just from a defensive element and what that added, because defense wound up being the reason they won this thing.
You and I both. I was looking much more at the unders for Florida towards back half of the season when they added Henlogden. That treated me very well, and that defense, that rebounding, it was so paramount for them towards the stretch run. As joining me on the show, we do have Blake Lovell, who does great work over at Southeastern 16, joining me on Cuss Cuss Hoops. And now I think that this is a question on everyone's mind. How sustainable is it what the SEC did this season? Because I think all 16 teams winning 10-plus games outside the conference might be a little bit difficult to be able to pull off. That said, I don't think that the SEC is going anywhere whatsoever. Again, maybe you have 1 or 2 down teams, unlike this season where, I mean, other than South Carolina, who probably would have been, let's call it what it is, probably like a top 5, top 6 team in the ACC. When that's your worst team, they are completely loaded. But with the way that these schools have all bought into basketball, the way that they're dumping in money, the way that they're recruiting, getting great coaches, I don't think that this is a one-off for the SEC. And And while they might not be getting 13 to 14 teams in the NCAA tournament, I think that this is a sign of things to come for a long time for this conference.
Yeah, and again, you know, I'm the SEC guy, and I try to look at it from an optimistic standpoint every year. But even I know, like 14 teams, it's not happening next season. Like, I mean, listen, we can pull this clip, Greg. It's the power of audio, right? Like, you can pull this clip.
I'm sure you'd be happy to be wrong.
Sure, absolutely. Anyone can pull this clip and show it to me if I'm wrong. But it is going to be hard to replicate it. I mean, for obvious reasons. And you mentioned one of the ones that I've kind of brought up this week when I've been asked that question a lot throughout, you know, towards the end of this tournament. The non-conference is really where everything was made this season. And I think as you get into conference play, that becomes such a focus and everything is reactionary to what happens just in conference play. But it's really what you did before that. And that's what allowed the SEC to be in this position this year, to be sitting here with 14 teams in the tournament, to get as many as they got to the Sweet 16, the Elite Eight, the Final Four, and then, of course, win the national championship. It was really what teams were able to do early in the season that set the tone for what they could become. And the numbers were in the SEC's favor once you got into those conference games because the strength of schedule was only going to get better. That helped you in the net, BPI, like all these things. And so it was easy to understand why the analytics loved the SEC, why from the eye test, how could you not? Because you did have every single team that had 10 plus wins going into conference play. We've just not seen that before. And so inevitably, some of these teams are going to take a step back. And what's kind of maybe ironic here, Greg, is that it seems like two of the teams that have the most momentum right now in the transfer portal are LSU and South Carolina. And they were the two teams that, as we know, missed the tournament from the SEC. And so I think that's what's going to be fascinating to watch because you would think that those two, with the way they're doing so far in the transfer portal, have a chance to take a step forward. But you got to replace somebody if you're going to do that. What are the teams, let's say, that finish lower? Let's say Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, Georgia, teams like that. What are they going to do to kind of not only stay in that spot? All right, bubble, get in, you're in the tournament, great. But how do you move forward? But how do you kind of, prevent moving backwards, knowing that, all right, maybe LSU steps forward, maybe South Carolina does, and all that stuff. So I think that's what's going to be most interesting to me is just to see how many of these teams can sort of sustain this level of success. The coaching is there. The NIL support should be there. But, I will say early on in the transfer portal, yeah, there have been some SEC teams that have swung and missed on some big players out there. You've seen them go to other conferences, other places. And so it's a long game, though, as we know, in this transfer portal cycle. Last year at this time, we were still weeks away from Kentucky even building their roster. You had some other guys, who committed. I think Elijah Martin. Florida was someone who committed like third week of April, something like that. So we've got a ways to go, but I don't think it's, fair to say all of a sudden, well, the SEC got 14 in this year. There's your new standard. I just think it was a very unique season, and quite frankly, I don't think the SEC or anyone else will replicate it anytime soon.
I don't think so either. Like, we remember that historic year that the ACC had many, many years ago. And then from there, it's all been downhill from there. Certainly, I don't think it's going to be all downhill for the SEC because they keep sticking in their money, and the ACC, they lost a lot of those coaches that allowed them to have that success, and that's not happening in the SEC anytime soon. But certainly it's going to be interesting to see because, as we know, Blake, it does feel like there's becoming a little bit more of a divide between the haves and the have-nots in terms of mid-majors and the power conferences. How do you take a look at this balance? Because the big gripe that everyone had with this year's NCAA tournament was you didn't have that Cinderella team that made a run, and I don't feel like you need an NC State who needs to win their ACC tournament and go all the way to the Final Four. I don't think that you need quite that, but I do think that it is interesting what has been happening in college basketball because we just mentioned it with the SEC. A guy on the bench in the SEC is probably going to be getting paid more than your top guy in insert like the Mountain West, insert your favorite mid to high major conference here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really that battle now to where if you're going to win at that level, not just, again, against the teams you're competing against in conference, but are you going to go out and win these non-conference games? Are you going to be able to get into the NCAA tournament and win the kind of games against, like you mentioned, a team that maybe is paying a guy that's third off the bench, that makes more than anybody else on your roster? I mean, it's basketball. You can certainly game plan and come up with all these things, and we've seen, teams that are less talented win before, and that will continue to happen. But I don't want to go fully to the extreme of saying we're going to get number one seeds in the Final Four every year, or maybe have, a lack of upsets like we had this year. But we all know it's realistic to think, well, the times are changing a bit in terms of, where players are going. And a lot of it does have to do, like we said, with just sort of the NIL that's out there and just the amount of money that we know are being, thrown around. And I think Lamont Paris went on, some SEC show not long ago, and sort of talking about, hey, here's what it costs you to get a starter in the SEC. And I think he may have threw out $1 million or something like that. That's maybe what you're working with here in terms of setting that as sort of the baseline for some of these players. And you think about, conferences that are mid-major, low major, they're not doing that. Like, there's not that level of probably support at all those places. And we understand that's the way it is, but it will be interesting to see how this continues to sort of, move from here. Again, I don't think it's going to be to the extreme we saw this year. I mean, this was sort of a historic year, especially with those top seeds. We said it. I mean, that was the best group of 1 seeds to play in a Final Four ever. That was probably the greatest, group of teams to play in the Final Four, just from a statistical standpoint. Sure, you can, find some teams that maybe were rated lower in the analytics and all that, but still, it was hard to argue that the 4 best teams got there this year. That won't always happen. You'll have upsets along the way and all that, but there is a shift in terms of the balance. And again, a lot of it just has to do with how much can you pay. That's the new game in college basketball.
Yep, it certainly is a pay-for-play game in college basketball right now, so that is going to be very interesting to gauge. And Blake, how interesting is it as well that we've seen guys sign earlier than ever before? Because you just mentioned it with Elijah Martin. He was a guy that he went to Florida in late April. We've seen plenty of guys sign in like early May, but it feels like a lot of the top prospects are already off the board. Like just before we came on this podcast, Pop Isaacs, he decided that he was going to be going to Houston. We've got a lot of guys that have decided, you know what, I'm going to be taking my talents elsewhere. Trey Donaldson, he already transferred out as well. Like that's a guy that you remember very well when he was over at Auburn a few years ago as well. How much do you take a look at that for this offseason and teams really trying to be getting ahead of things, because there were a lot of prospects and there were a lot of coaches that were signed before the Nets were cut down at the Alamo Dome a few nights ago?
Yeah, and you got to think, right, that does play into the idea of like, the longer we wait, the more opportunity that there is out there for this guy to potentially get more money elsewhere. And I think that sort of, has to be a theme now when you're looking at this and just saying, hey, if there's a chance to get a guy, we better find a way to get him now, because if not, there's just so much opportunity out there that you never know, again, what that offer is going to look like that comes in next week, right? For a guy that, hey, I really want to get this guy on a roster, but the longer we wait, we better find a way to sort of lock it in now. And so it's important. And that's why I think, especially like I said, if you're looking at teams, let's say they're on the outside looking in, that's where, like, from a numbers standpoint, look at the work that LSU's done. Look at what South Carolina's done in terms of bringing in some guys, whether it's a Trace and Eagle staff, right? Or bringing back a Michi Johnson, who was there a couple of years ago, went to Ohio State, now he's back. Like, it's just, you have to sort of get that foundation in place as quickly as you can, because otherwise you just never know with the numbers that are out there. And again, just all the potential components that go into recruiting a player to your school now. It's just the longer you wait, the more opportunity there is for someone else to snag him. And I just think that's sort of the game that coaches are having to play right now.
Oh, I'm right there with you. I think that it's going to be a very interesting offseason. And Blake, is there just anything that you're looking at over the next few weeks in terms of what might be shaping this upcoming season? Because we've seen a lot of coaching changes, a few out there in the SEC and Texas A&M. That's obviously a situation that's a bit up in the air with Buzz Williams deciding to head on over to Maryland. And we know that Texas A&M, they've got deep pockets. They're certainly going to be able to sign someone very rock solid. And by the time that this podcast uploads, they might have already found their guy. But that said, what are you taking a look at right now for this offseason? Because a lot of people are thinking, oh, it's April, we don't need to worry about it. This is a sport that starts up after the Super Bowl, what have you. But the teams that we're going to be seeing in March of 2026, those teams, as we know, are built right now.
Yeah, they are. And I think that's where, especially when you're talking about, coaching changes and player exits and all that, like, this is where, what do the teams look like that don't even have players on the roster, or very few, right? That's where, I think back again, Kentucky was a good example. Sort of last year, Vanderbilt was in that boat. Whenever they hired Mark Byington, when Mark Pope took over at Kentucky, teams like that. There's not a lot of those out there right now, but that is where the teams that have the lesser numbers, and like we said, it's sort of just a race to see who can fill their roster the fastest. And we know too, right? There are so many guys that have to go through the draft process, and it's a little more predictable, obviously, than it used to be based on the rule changes and all that. But still, you're waiting around to see, okay, you never know when a guy that you're completely relying on, you have a certain maybe amount allotted for this guy, and then all of a sudden he goes into the draft process and like, he's not coming back. So then what do you do? Like, and I think that's just where, and we said it, it's just that the challenges for some of these coaches in terms of figuring out how they fill these rosters, it does get a lot more interesting. And so, yeah, like, you do look at a situation like at a Maryland. Buzz Williams is completely sort of bringing in, some of his guys we know from Texas A&M, but there's a lot of places he's got to fill in that roster. It's the same for coaches, like a Nico Medved now at Minnesota, and just places like that. I think that's, to me, is the biggest thing to watch over the next little bit, because it's not always a matter of volume, it's a matter of quality. But sometimes right now, if you're a school that's lost a lot of guys to transfer, or if you have a new coach coming in and you kind of understand that you're going to be flipping the roster, this is, as you said, Greg, where your team is made. And so that's where I think, for coaching changes like that, West Virginia and so forth, this is where you really start to figure out, okay, can we build the kind of roster we need to have success right away? We've seen a lot of coaches do it, but it's not the easiest thing when you kind of have, the time frame you're working with and such a quick turnaround in this sort of era of transfers.
No question about it. It is not easy, and it is a very difficult sport to gauge. I've been posting this up the last few days. I cannot try to even be able to handicap and gauge a sport without looking at it all 365 days of the year, because as we're doing this podcast, Blake, over 2,000 guys have entered in the transfer portal. We've seen over 50 teams change your coach, so there's a lot to parse through, and even though the games are not going to be taking part until November, I know that you are very hard at work taking a look at what we're going to be getting, much like myself, for the next season. So, Blake, love the good people at home. Know it's all on tap for you, and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, always appreciate it, Greg. Yeah, as we just said, we will be talking lots of transfers. We do this year-round for SEC basketball on the channel, Southeastern 16 on YouTube. So, yeah, we'll be talking all the big transfers. We've talked about quite a few here recently, whether Keyshawn Hall to Auburn, Jacoby Gillespie to Tennessee, of course, Jaden Quaidon's headed to Kentucky, finally, for Kentucky fans. So, yeah, lots of transfer stuff we'll have throughout this transfer cycle. And of course, we'll start to, as you will, do our best to look ahead to next season and try to figure out what we can expect. You can follow all of our SEC stuff on YouTube, Southeastern 16, and everything else you can find me on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell.
Absolutely. Blake does an amazing job gauging this sport all 12 months out of the year, not just during SEC play, but he is doing a great job around the clock taking a look at college basketball, and it's always appreciated when he joins this podcast. So big thanks to Blake for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And coming up next, another rambunctious day of college basketball news. We'll take a look at what we've all gotten over the last 24 hours. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. It is always a pleasure to get Blake Lovell aboard, who does such amazing work over at Southeastern 16, taking a look at this great game of college basketball that we all know and love. Every single time he joins me, he lends tremendous insights. He did so once again today, so a big thanks to our good friend in Blake for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you a roundup of all the news and notes that we saw in college basketball on Wednesday. Big time move with Dallin Hall going from BYU on over to Virginia. This is the exact sign of life that Virginia does need, and keep in mind that with Ryan Odom, he actually used to be coaching over there on the West Coast. He was actually over at Utah State for a season or two, so I think that those ties might have been able to help him to be able to get this one done. As for Hall, he was rock solid for BYU last season, and he's going to be able to give some nice three-point shooting pop for the team as well last season. He was able to supply the team with about 7 points per contest, doled out over 4 assists, shot 35.5% from three-point. It's a very new look Virginia team, because when you have a coaching change, you lose darn near everyone. So the likes of Andrew Rohde and company that we came to know and love, well, they are no longer there for Virginia, but being able to get in a guy like Hall who's able to do a nice job doling out the ball, was in a little bit more of an up-tempo system, and have to feel like Virginia is no longer going to be like in the bottom 5 in all of college basketball in terms of total possessions per game after these moves in the offseason, which good to see them getting out of the Stone Age. That should be able to help them out quite a bit. That's a nice pickup for them, so I do like the fact that they were able to get a guard like that, and that should be able to help them out moving forward. This should also be a help moving forward. You've got Drew Washington heading on over to Miami, and Jai Lucas has done a really nice job with this Miami team thus far, as they're bringing in some big-time guys with Washington. He was very true to his name. He was that number 3 scorer for New Mexico this past season, 11 points per contest, shot about 34% from 3, was really good towards the beginning part of the season with regards to his three-point shooting. That did fall off the table a little bit, but all in all, this is a guy that should be able to deliver quite a bit of production. I do think that there's going to be quite a bit of upside with what he's able to bring to the table, and this is a Miami squad that they just really need a fresh breath of life in general, because with Jai Lucas, I do think that he's going to be able to deliver that. As we recall during the season this past year, one of the biggest disappointments that we saw in all of college basketball, so that was relatively rough for them. And Miami, very early beyond here in the transfer portal. They haven't necessarily made like quantum moves or anything like that, but bringing in him, you also have Ernest Uday, who was rock solid down low over at TCU. Trey Donaldson was solid for a Michigan team. I was able to make a run in the NCAA tournament. Blake Renew down low is pretty rock solid as well. I do like the moves that Miami is making, so that's a impact guy that I think is going to be able to give this team quite a bit more moving forward. If you're looking at being able to get quite a bit more moving forward as well, Jameer Watkins is a guy that I think is going to be interesting. He did enter into the transfer portal. Again, I'm not going to be reporting upon too many of these guys that are jumping in the transfer portal because, in my opinion, it's much bigger news when a guy is not in the transfer portal rather than when a guy is in the transfer portal, because right now we've got 2,028 guys in the transfer portal. Yeah, it's going to be a lot to be able to decipher, and it's a lot to try to digest in general, so there's a lot to be taking a look at on this front, and I'll be doing my absolute best to be able to relay all these to you, as I don't even have the time to be able to give you guys more of these guys that are going down to like the Division 2, Division 3 level, what have you. So unfortunately, you do have to get a little bit more of a metered version. When we get into more of the late summer months, we're going to be able to decipher what we're getting a little bit more. That'll be nice. Like, you do have a guy like a Tay Dozier who is really good at the NAIA level for Georgetown College. He's going to be going on over to Northern Kentucky. Those are some of the things that I do need to sort of leave out as of right now, because you do have a lot of junior college guys that are going to be committing here as well. So there's a lot to be taking a look at. But you do have a guy in AJ Casey who last season he was over at St. Louis, and St. Louis just refused to use their bench last season. Like, AJ Casey was a guy that, if I'm not mistaken, he was at the Power Conference level to begin his career. I thought that he had a little bit of upside with St. Louis, a former top 100 recruit. He just was unable to get out there on the floor this past season. When he was over at Miami, he 2 seasons ago averaged only about 2 points per contest, was never really able to flourish as a 6'9" big man. But I do think that this is going to be a good opportunity for him. He's going to be able to get plenty of minutes. Evansville, they certainly need a little bit more down low, so that's going to be able to help them out. So I do like the upside there. Will Cooper, who was over at Air Force last season, is going to be going to Nebraska, and these are some of the moves where it's like, what the heck are we doing here? Because for Nebraska, you have to think that this guy is going to be nothing more than a walk-on. Perhaps he's going to be able to provide a little bit of just like that bench guy spark or something like that, because this Air Force team last year was absolutely terrible, and Will Cooper did not really give anything to Air Force. He was averaging 5.5 points per contest, did shoot 37.5% from 3 at 6'6". That's not absolutely awful, but he wasn't seeing a gob ton of minutes ever at an Air Force program that was one of the worst in all of college basketball. For Nebraska, we saw them win the Crown title, so congratulations to them. I'm sure that they would rather win games in the NCAA tournament rather than the Crown, but hey, won something. But that said, yeah, I do think that it's going to be very interesting to see what we're going to be getting on that from a Nebraska team that they do have to replace quite a bit of that backcourt from a season ago. They had a lot of veterans out there, unfortunately fell short of expectations and held the Crown, and then they were able to bring it in the Crown, but that said, do want to see what you're going to be able to get out of them moving forward. Andre 3000 Mills, he was over at Texas A&M this last year, was unable to get out there on the floor. He had to redshirt. He is going to be heading on over to Maryland. Do have to feel like with Maryland for them losing a few guys during the offseason, and if I'm not mistaken, Rodney Rice is currently in the transfer portal. They're going to need to try to add a little bit more depth to be able to just replace what they had a season ago. And for Mills, according to 247 Sports, was a top 100 prospect in the class of 2024. He heads on over there, 6'4" guard that has dealt with a few injuries throughout his career. Like I said, he redshirted last season. I do think that there's a little bit of upside there. Is he going to be the next Rodney Rice or anything like that? Probably not. But if you can get someone out there that's able to come in off the bench, make a few threes for you, I think that that's going to be big. And obviously Maryland going through a lot of changes with regards to the coaching staff. And as we know, you bring in a coach in Buzz Williams, was over at Texas A&M last season. He was one of their recruits, so he's going to be following them, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of that moving forward, because we've yet to see a lot of these guys follow their former coaches on over to their new places, but we know that a lot of that is going to be coming sooner rather than later, and a lot of commitments are going to be coming within the next few weeks, as well as we still have a lot of guys that are entering into the transfer portal. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at things from, I believe, Sunday until now, we've seen another 100 guys enter in the transfer portal. You've got about 2.5 to 3 weeks for these guys to be able to enter. So I do think that we're going to be seeing more and more of that moving forward. And something that we're seeing more and more of is these guys committing, as RJ Smith is going to be going on over to DePaul after last year. He was at Colorado. When he was over at Colorado, he did an okay job of being able to pop it from three-point range. Shot 39% from three, 6 points, 2.5 boards. It was a really disappointing Colorado team, but I mean, on a team where there wasn't a heck of a lot out there, he was able to do a pretty rock-solid job, so I think that that's going to be interesting moving forward. You've got a few guys entering into the NBA draft. A lot of non-surprises like Trey Holloman. This was a little bit over 24 hours ago, was rock-solid over at Michigan State this last season, doling out the ball, one of their main guards for that team. He has entered in the NBA draft. Cedric Howard is going to be as well. He's also going to be in the transfer portal, and you'll notice this, with a lot of guys that enter into the NBA draft, they're also going to be entering their name into the portal. For Coward, he was only able to play in 6 games this past season, was really good over at Eastern Washington 2 seasons ago. In a small sample size this year, he was the top scorer for Washington State in those 6 games that he actually played. 17.5 points per contest at 6'6", has always been a career mid-30s 3-point shooter, so we shall see what is going to be happening with him moving forward, but I'm very fascinated to see what his outlook is going to be, because he's got a few different options that he's going to be parsing through. Papa Endai, he was a 7-footer over at UNLV last season that was able to be rock solid down low in the minutes that he played, about 3.5 rebounds at a block per game, about 13 minutes per contest. He's going on over to Xavier. I have to think that he's nothing more than a depth piece. If he's seeing massive minutes, then Xavier probably going to be in a little bit of rough shape, but you know what? You've got the Mountain West ties with Richard Pitino coaching over there at New Mexico this past season, so I do think that he's going to be able to provide, at the very least, a little bit of energy for the team in general. You should be able to get some good energy from this guy, as well as you've got Martin Carey. He's going to be heading on over from VCU to Ryan Odom and Virginia, so that was another W for Virginia on Wednesday. Comes over after he was playing for the French national team in the under-18 Euro FIBA tournament last summer. He was unable to get out there on the floor last season over at VCU, but he's a 6'8" wing that's able to pop it from three-point range. A little bit of an international man of mystery, and I do think that he's going to be able to provide a little bit of spark there, and that should be able to give a little bit of depth just immediately for this team, and that's something that's going to be very critical for them. Something else that's going to be very critical is the fact that Nebraska, they were able to get another commitment, not just Mr. Will Cooper, but Kendall Blue. So they're feeling Blue double D, double die as he goes on over from St. Thomas to Nebraska. And Nebraska's been able to hit on some of these up transfers, as for Blue, you do have to have a little bit of a question mark with the defense, because St. Thomas, well, they didn't play a ton of it, but Blue was a 6'6" wing last season that shot 42% from three-point range, was able to supply the team with 12.5 points, a little bit over 2.5 assists, a steal per contest. I do like the upside for him, so I do think that that is a relatively good pickup for Nebraska. This is also a little bit of a upside guy, as well as Robert Viola. Last season was the top rebounder over at San Jose State, was averaging 7.5 points, 7.5 boards, a little bit over a block and a half per contest. He's heading on over to Minnesota. It's a new dawn and a new day for Minnesota, because it was Dawson Garcia was like the only player that was able to give you a relatively good effort for them. As we know, they hired on in the offseason a man that was out there in the Mountain West, and Nico Medved, so utilize those connections to be able to bring in the 6'8" big man in Viola. I do think that instantly Minnesota becomes just a little bit more of a force in general, and I do think that this is a really good pickup for them. I also think that this is going to be a relatively solid pickup, as McNeese is going to be bringing in Jarrell Colbert. Colbert, he's a 6'10" big man that really couldn't get out there on the floor too much for SMU this past season, but he's a guy that's got a lot of power experience. You saw him over at LSU, Kansas State as well, and with him heading on over to McNeese, a school that they're now going to be under the tutelage of the assistant in Armstrong, who was over at Baylor this past season. They're going to be looking to try to build off of what Will Wade was able to really lay down there. I don't know if they're quite going to be able to do so, but I do think that moving forward there is a little bit of upside there, and being able to bring in a guy like Colbert, I think that he's going to see a bunch of minutes and he's going to be able to flourish out there in the Southland. You've got TK Simpkins. Now this begs the question what his brother TJ is going to be doing, but TK Simpkins, who was over at Elon last season, he has decided that he is going to be heading on over to Oregon. He was a better three-point shooter of the Simpkins brothers, as both guys averaged 15-plus points per contest. TK shot 37% from three, 2.5 assists, a steal, 16.5 points per contest. Again, what his brother does is going to be a little bit of a question mark, but TK Simpkins heading on over to Oregon, relatively good at, and Oregon has done a really good job of hitting on these transfer guards. Boise State got a relatively good addition with bringing in Drew Felder on Wednesday. He was over at Georgetown this past season. Saw a little bit of a fall from his freshman year. 7 points, 4.5 to 5.5 rebounds per game at 6'11". He's able to pop it from three. Wasn't necessarily a great three-point shooter, but being able to bring him in after I'm pretty sure Tyson Dagenhart now out of eligibility. A lot of those Boise State guys, they were in year number 5, so they need to be able to add a little bit down low. This is going to be a relatively nice pickup for them. This is a rarity. We are actually seeing a guy return to school, Christian Moore, who tried to give the Citadel more. They were one of the most rough schools in all of college basketball this year. 8.5 points per contest. Not a great three-point shooter, but 6'6" combo player. He's going to be returning there, so some rare good news for the Citadel. And as we know, with the Citadel, they're having a little bit of a tough time bringing in transfers. When you get a military institute like that, always makes it difficult. And when it comes to Louisiana, they are very much looking to turn over a new leaf. The Bob Marlin days are now done for them, and they're looking to do so with Darius Woodson. Woodson was a 6'7", little bit of a stretch player last season over at North Dakota. As we know, with North Dakota, relatively solid offense, played absolutely no defense whatsoever last season, but for Woodson, he was able to throw in there 8.5 points per contest, shot about 31% from three-point range, 6'7", little bit of a combo joker player. He's going to be adding on over there, so that's going to be able to give them a nice little bit of a shot in the arm, and we'll see what other moves they have coming down the pipeline moving forward. And then you saw Tyree Bryan, who he had a nice year this last year with Santa Clara. Shot over 42% from three-point range, 10.5 points, 4.5 boards. He was a little bit of a starter / a sixth man for them. He is going to be heading on over to Texas Tech. Relatively good addition there. We've seen this Texas Tech program, by the way, take guys that were solid at their previous school but weren't necessarily amazing and really be able to transform them. This has been a program that's been very good at being able to have all these guys be able to mix and match in their process. So I do think that one is going to be able to pan out for them. Jerry Gogpop, he last year was over at Louisiana Monroe. He's a 6'11" big man that's going to give you a lot more on the defensive side of things. He was a starter, but only gave the team about 4.5 boards, 6 points per contest, capable of giving you a block or so per game. He is going to be adding on over to Coastal Carolina. For Coastal Carolina, was a little bit of a rough go of it for them in year number 1, but they do have quite a bit of money in NIL, and if you go over to their college football stadium, I believe that you're getting free concessions this year, so that's a nice shout out to them. And North Carolina is pulling the trigger on Kion Evans. It's been a good last few hours for them, as Evans last season was over at Colorado State, part of that team that was able to make the NCAA tournament. He was able to give the team 10.5 point shot, 45% from 3, and they're going to be getting Seth Trimble back as well. He is not going to be entering in the transfer portal. He is going to be returning to school. Now, we did see Ian Jackson decide that he is going to be transferring elsewhere, and they are, I believe, out of eligibility for R.J. Davis as well, who has been in school for 100 billion years, but that's going to be solid for them, obviously. Losing Elliot Cadu, who was able to give the team north of 6 assists per contest. It's going to be a little bit of a transformed team, and I have to feel like North Carolina is going to be looking a little bit more down low as well. They also lost Jalen Washington in the transfer portal, but Evans is a solid player. Might be a little bit more like the Cade Tyson situation that we saw last year, where Tyson, he was rock solid over at Belmont, didn't see a lot of minutes this past season over at North Carolina. He is going to be a little bit of an up transfer, but certainly that's going to be able to help out this North Carolina team moving forward. And Giannis Bamba, he only played 4 games this last season over at Wichita State, 6'5", a little bit of a highly touted guy coming out of the country of Canada. He's going to be heading on over to Maine, and this is a good pickup for Maine, because with the Black Bears, this has been a team that has very much prided themselves on defense over the last few years. As a matter of fact, they had a guy that ranked in the top 3 with regards to steals per game 2 out of the last 3 years in Kellen Tynes. I know that they're going to be losing him each of their top 4 scorers, whether they're in their 4th year or their 5th year, so there's going to be a lot of pieces that they are going to need to replace, bringing in a guy like Bamba, who he hasn't seen a lot of minutes at the college level, but he is a guy with a little bit of upside, has some athleticism. That should be going well for them, and what is going well for us is deciphering what we're all going to be getting in college basketball this season. I know that we are many, many months away from being able to bet on these teams, but rosters that are going to be ones that you're going to trust in this season, they're built right now, and it is very important to be keeping up with all that happens in college basketball, because my goodness, trying to be able to decipher a sport of 364 Division I teams, it is a full year process, and I am going to do my best to be able to put you guys in the best position here. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Go Soups, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And if you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, You have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GUnit_81. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter, so per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And big thanks to Blake Lovell, who does such amazing work over at Southeastern 16. You join me in the live segment, and I'll be with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.